Passing data to event handler functions is very straightforward. We have a couple of options for how to do it. We can pass the data from the trigger method, or we can specify the data when we attach the event handler. We'll explore both of these options. In either case, the data we pass to the event handler function must be an object or an array. This is the same code from the last section. We've collapsed parts of the code to remove some of the clutter as we make changes. The last section left us with custom events attached directly to the internal object variable. Let's make a new variable that's specific for event notifications. We can use this as a central processing point for multiple custom events if we so choose. We're creating a standard jQuery object that we can use to attach event handlers to. jQuery doesn't care about the contents of the object. The only property of our object is node name. We did this to provide a better description for the showMessageEvent function. Remember in the last section when we discussed the node name showing a string containing unknown. The logic that checks for the node name is shown here. We mentioned that all we would have to do is add a node name property to our internal object and we would get a more descriptive message. Since we're going to attach our event handler function to the new notify object, that's the right place to add the node name property. Now, our messages should show the text internal instead of unknown. If we see the text unknown, that will indicate we've encountered an unexpected situation. Next, we'll make use of the notify object in the trigger method instead of the internal object. Why did we do this? There was nothing wrong with triggering the event on the object that contains the data we're interested in. We know from the previous section that the logic works when attaching event handlers directly to the data object. What if we wanted to know when other things within the system also happened? Instead of attaching events to multiple internal objects, we can use a single object to centralize all of our custom events. Now we can use it to attach the records loaded event, as well as attach future events, such as the customer is impressed event, or the very far-fetched boss gives a raise event. The point is, as we identify the need for new custom events in the future, having a single object for all the handlers can make a lot of sense. It's totally a judgment call, however. Now we need to use the notify object when we attach the records loaded event. The on method is exactly the same. It's just attaching the handler function to a different object. Let's pause for a moment and verify that the page still performs as we expect before we start passing data with the events. As we see, the events process in the same manner as before when we click the button. If we click it again, we see the same behavior as we did in the last section. The record messages appear immediately and show before the click message for the div. The records loaded message shows the text internal instead of unknown. The node name property on the notify object is producing the result we want. Now, let's pass some data to our event. So far, we've referenced the internal object variable directly. Since it is defined in this page, we have full access to it. What if the data records were loaded in some external process and we didn't have direct access anymore? We could just pass the internal object as a parameter to the event handler function from the external source. There are two different ways to do this. We'll start with passing the data along with the trigger method. Let's pretend that the internal object has scope only to the load record event. Since we're calling this routine recursively with our setTimeout function, we can't actually make that the case. If the load record function was actually retrieving data from a server, there wouldn't be an issue. The server would most likely return all records with a single function call. Since we're not dealing with a real server, we have to do our best. Anyway, let's proceed as if no other location in the code can reference the internal object variable. We can pass that object as a parameter of the trigger method, like this. We just added it as a second parameter to the trigger method. All we have to do is add the data we want to pass as a second parameter. Keep in mind the data must be either an array or an object. Now let's see how we make use of it in our event handler. To make sure we're not referencing the internal object by mistake, we'll add a parameter to the event handler function with the name of the object. This parameter will contain any object that is passed from the trigger method. Now we just need to loop through the records in the object we received as a parameter instead of using internal object directly. Our records loaded event handler function on the notify object is no longer using the internal object. It's only using data passed as a parameter. Now, when we run this in Firefox, we see the records just as before. However, this time, they are coming from the parameter, not the internal variable. This means we can have the records passed to our event handler from an external process instead of within the script on this page. Clicking the button the second time works exactly as it did before. Passing the parameter along with the trigger method works fine for custom events. What if we want to pass data along with a standard event? We don't have control over the trigger method for standard events, so there's no way to attach a parameter at the time the event is triggered. That's where the second option comes in. jQuery allows a data object parameter to be specified when we use the on method. This object will be passed to the event handler as part of the event parameter. Let's look at the mechanics of this by extending the click event handler we currently have in place. To pass a parameter with a system-generated event, we must have access to the data we want passed. We have to stop pretending now because we're going to pass our internal object variable to the on method as the second parameter. This tells jQuery to include the data when the event is processed by our handler function. We've extended the processing that occurs when the button is clicked. Before we load the records, we display a message that tells how many records are in the internal object. We'll use this for quick visibility into the records array to inspect its length when we click the button. The data that was passed in as a parameter is attached to the event object as the data property. When we included the internal object with the on method, it told jQuery to pass that data along with the event every time the handler function is called. jQuery adds the data to the event parameter that is already passed to our handler. jQuery extends the single parameter object that our handler expects, just like we did in the first segment of this video. The contract for our handler function is still valid because the parameter count didn't change. It's just up to us to make use of the new data property of the event object. If we don't include the internal object as a second parameter on the on method, the data property of the event parameter will be undefined. Here's an important point to remember. Objects are passed to functions by reference, not by value. This means the event handler is actually just getting a pointer to the internal object variable, not a copy of it. Each time the event handler is called, the event data property will reflect the latest state of the internal object variable. This is easier to follow with a demonstration. First, we'll just click the button once. We see the record count message which states there are no records loaded. This is what we expect since this is the first time we've clicked the button. When we click it again, the record count indicates a total of 5 records, also what we expect. Let's refresh the page and try something else. We'll click the button 2 times, but not quickly enough to warrant a double click. Notice the sequence of messages. First we get a click, followed by the record count message showing a length of 0. Then the click message for the div is displayed. Since we clicked the button before all the records were loaded, we get another click event followed by a message showing how many records were loaded up to that point. In this case, 2. The second click message for the div was displayed, and then we got the records loaded message twice. The 2 records loaded messages are in response to the records loaded events that were triggered after each button click. Going back to the record count, the message shows how many records were available on the internal object at the time of the event. The click event fired before all the records were loaded, so we got a snapshot of the state of the object at that time. This is a very powerful capability, and there are many uses for integrating data with events, both custom and system-generated. Passing data to event handlers is an excellent tool for our JavaScript and jQuery arsenal. We can pass data to custom events that we trigger or include them in system-generated events, as long as the data is an object or an array.